One of the most counterintuitive aspects of avoidant attachment is that their silence often intensifies precisely when they're developing deep feelings. For most people, falling in love creates desire for more contact. But for avoidants, falling in love triggers their deepest fears, causing them to go silent at the exact moment their feelings are strongest. This silence isn't indifference, it's overwhelm. Understanding why avoidant silence can indicate falling in love reveals the tragic contradiction. The more they feel, the more they retreat. Here's why an avoidant silence is often a sign they're falling in love. The silence happens because the feelings are becoming too real. When an avoidant starts falling in love, the feelings shift from controllable attraction to something deeper that feels dangerous. They're no longer just enjoying your company or finding you attractive. They're catching feelings that could lead to dependence, vulnerability, and loss of their defended self. This shift from casual interest to genuine love triggers panic that manifests as silence and withdrawal. The panic happens because falling in love means needing someone, which violates the avoidant's core identity as someone who doesn't need anyone. As long as feelings stayed surface level, the avoidant could maintain their self-image. But love creates needs, wants, desires to be close, all of which threaten the independence the avoidant has built their entire identity around. The silence is their attempt to regain control over feelings that are spiraling beyond their comfort zone. The withdrawal also serves to test whether the feelings will fade with distance. The avoidant goes silent, hoping that time apart will reduce the intensity of what they're feeling. They're trying to logic themselves out of love by creating space. But this strategy usually fails because love doesn't diminish with distance for most people. If anything, the silence intensifies their feelings as they miss you and think about you constantly while trying to convince themselves they don't. This dynamic explains why avoidance can be most present when feelings are casual and most absent when feelings deepen. The casual phase feels safe because nothing is at stake. But once love develops, everything feels at stake: their autonomy, their safety, their defended self, and the silence is their protection against those perceived threats. They're silent because they're processing overwhelming vulnerability. Falling in love requires vulnerability that avoidants are not equipped to handle. Love means letting someone matter, giving them power to hurt you, depending on them for happiness. For avoidants whose entire defensive structure is built to avoid these exact vulnerabilities, falling in love creates a crisis that often manifests as complete withdrawal and silence. The silence gives them space to try to process feelings they don't have tools to manage. They're experiencing emotions they've spent their life avoiding, needs they've suppressed, desires for closeness they've always feared. This internal overwhelm is too much to process while also engaging with you. So they go silent to deal with their internal crisis without the added complexity of managing the relationship simultaneously. The processing also includes the avoidant trying to figure out if they can allow themselves to love you. They're weighing the risk against the reward, analyzing whether their feelings are safe to act on, strategizing how to have love without vulnerability. This internal calculation requires distance because they can't think clearly when you're present, triggering more feelings. The silence is their attempt to get perspective that proximity prevents. The vulnerability crisis also makes communication feel impossible. How can they tell you they're falling in love when admitting that gives you enormous power over them? How can they be close when closeness intensifies feelings they're already struggling with? The silence becomes easier than trying to engage while in crisis about the feelings engagement creates. The silence protects them from revealing how much you matter. When avoidants fall in love, they become acutely aware that their feelings give you power over them. If you know they love you, you know you can hurt them, you know they need you, you know they're vulnerable to you. For someone whose safety depends on appearing unbothered and self-sufficient, these realizations are terrifying. The silence protects them from revealing the depth of feelings that would expose their vulnerability. The protection also extends to maintaining perceived power balance in the relationship. As long as they're silent and withdrawn, they seem less invested. They appear to need you less than you need them. This perceived imbalance gives them a sense of control and safety. But if they engaged openly while falling in love, their investment would become obvious and the power balance would shift, which feels threatening. The silence additionally serves as defense against potential rejection. If they reveal their love and you don't reciprocate with the same intensity, or if you leave or if you hurt them, the pain will be unbearable. But if they stay silent about their feelings, they protect themselves from that potential pain. The silence is emotional insurance against the vulnerability that honest expression would create. This protective silence often backfires because it creates distance that damages the relationship. The avoidant is trying to protect their feelings by hiding them, but hiding them makes you feel unloved, which might cause you to leave, which creates the exact loss they were trying to prevent. The silence meant to protect actually creates the outcome they fear. They go silent to avoid the engulfment they associate with love. For avoidance, love and engulfment are deeply connected. Their childhood experiences taught them that love means losing themselves, being controlled, having boundaries violated, or being responsible for someone else's emotions. So when they start falling in love as adults, they unconsciously associate those feelings with the threat of engulfment. The silence is their way of maintaining distance to prevent the loss of self they fear love brings. The engulfment fear makes the avoidant feel like they're being swallowed by the relationship when feelings deepen. What others might experience as beautiful intimacy, the avoidant experiences as suffocation. What others might feel as close connection, the avoidant feels as loss of autonomy. The silence creates physical and emotional space to counteract this feeling of being consumed. The withdrawal also represents the avoidant reclaiming their identity, separate from the relationship. When falling in love, they start to notice you're always on their mind, they're considering you in their decisions, they want to share things with you. These are normal love experiences, but to the avoidant, they feel like loss of independence. The silence is them reasserting themselves as separate, reminding themselves they existed before you and can exist without you. This fear of engulfment means the avoidant often pulls away hardest from people they love most. The person who triggers the deepest feelings is the person who feels most threatening to their autonomy. So they go silent with you while maybe staying engaged with others who matter less, creating the painful irony where their silence indicates significance rather than insignificance. The silence is their way of managing the fear of inevitable loss. When avoidants fall in love, they immediately start anticipating loss. They think about you leaving, dying, changing, losing interest. These catastrophic thoughts about inevitable loss are overwhelming and create preemptive grief that manifests as silence and withdrawal. They're trying to protect themselves from future pain by creating distance now. The anticipatory loss also makes every moment of closeness bittersweet. Even when things are good, the avoidant is thinking about how it will end, how you could hurt them, how loss is inevitable. This inability to be present with love without immediately jumping to future loss makes engagement painful. The silence allows them to avoid the pain of being close while waiting for loss. The withdrawal additionally serves as practice for the loss they expect. If they get used to your absence now by going silent, maybe the actual loss won't hurt as much. This is obviously flawed logic, but it's how the avoidance fear-based mind works. They create the loss they fear through their silence, essentially fulfilling their own prophecy that love leads to abandonment. This fear of loss also makes the avoidant question whether letting themselves love you is worth the inevitable pain they believe will come. During the silence, they're weighing whether the love is worth the future loss. Often they conclude it's not, which makes them maintain distance to prevent deeper feelings from developing, even though deeper feelings have already developed, and that's what triggered the silence. What their silence reveals about the depth of their feelings. The fact that an avoidant goes silent specifically when falling in love reveals those feelings are profound and threatening in ways casual attraction never was. If you didn't matter deeply, they wouldn't need this level of defensive withdrawal. If the feelings were manageable, they could stay engaged. The silence is proportional to the significance of what they're feeling, which means deep silence often indicates deep feeling. The withdrawal also shows they're having internal experiences about you that overwhelm their capacity to manage. They're not just thinking about you occasionally, you're consuming their thoughts. They're not just enjoying your company, they're dependent on it. They're not just attracted, they're falling in love. And all of this internal intensity requires the external silence to manage. The silence particularly indicates love when it follows a period of connection. If the avoidant was engaged, warm, and present, and then suddenly goes silent, that shift reveals something changed internally. And what changed is likely that feelings deepened past their comfort zone. The pattern of connection followed by withdrawal is classic avoidant response to developing real feelings. The depth of feeling is also evident in how the avoidant acts during the silence. Are they monitoring you from a distance? Are they struggling not to reach out? Are they clearly affected when they do interact with you? These signs during silence reveal you're constantly on their mind, that they're fighting feelings, that they care intensely even while withdrawn. Why this silence is different from indifference? It's crucial to distinguish between silence that indicates falling in love and silence that indicates genuine disinterest. Indifferent silence is consistent, easy, unbothered. The avoidant doesn't struggle with it. They're not monitoring you. They're not fighting urges to reach out. They're just genuinely unaffected and moving on with their life. But silence born from falling in love has tension in it. You can feel the avoidant's struggle. They might go silent, but then break it with brief contact before retreating again. They might be silent, but you know they're watching your social media or asking mutual friends about you. They might seem fine, but there's an edge to their silence that reveals effort rather than ease. The timing also distinguishes the two types of silence. If silence comes after deepening intimacy, vulnerable conversations, or increased closeness, it's more likely fear-based silence indicating strong feelings. But if silence comes after conflict without resolution, after you expressing needs they can't meet, or after they've clearly moved on to someone else, it's more likely genuine disinterest. Your own sense often distinguishes them too. If you feel in your gut that they care but are scared, trust that. If you sense genuine indifference, trust that. Your nervous system picks up on subtle cues that reveal whether silence is defensive or genuine, and honoring your instinct about which you're experiencing is important. What you should do about silence that indicates they're falling in love. Understanding that their silence might mean they're falling in love doesn't mean you should wait around. You're still being left in painful uncertainty. You're still not getting your needs met. You're still dealing with someone who responds to love by withdrawing. This pattern is unsustainable regardless of what's driving it. The healthiest response is usually to let them have their silence while you move forward with your life. If their falling in love triggers this level of dysfunction, they're not ready for relationship with you. They need therapeutic work to develop capacity to be with their feelings. You also need to assess whether you want to be with someone whose response to love is silence and withdrawal. Do you want to live with someone who retreats when feelings deepen? Or do you deserve someone who moves toward you when falling in love? The internal battle happening during their silence. During the silence when an avoidant is falling in love, they're experiencing an intense internal battle between their feelings and their fears. Part of them wants to be close to you, but another part is terrified of vulnerability, loss, and engulfment. This battle is exhausting and all-consuming. The conflict also includes the avoidant trying to logic themselves out of feelings that aren't logical. They list your flaws. They remind themselves of incompatibilities. But none of this diminishes the feelings because love isn't rational. The internal battle also involves shame about their response. They know their silence is hurtful. They recognize their withdrawal damages the relationship. But knowing this doesn't give them tools to behave differently. Why the silence gets worse before it gets better. When an avoidant is falling in love, the silence often intensifies over time. This happens because the feelings continue to deepen despite the distance. The avoidant creates space, hoping feelings will diminish, but instead they grow stronger, requiring even more distance. The escalating silence also occurs because the avoidant becomes aware they're hurting you, which adds guilt to overwhelming emotions. This guilt makes engagement feel harder because they'd have to face what their silence has done. The worsening pattern also reflects the avoidant becoming more entrenched in their defensive position. The longer they're silent, the harder it becomes to break that silence. The difference between healthy space and avoidant silence. It's important to distinguish between an avoidant's fear-based silence when falling in love and healthy space that secure people sometimes need. Healthy space is communicated. The person says they need time to process, they give a time frame, they check in during the space. It's a mutual decision or at least an explained one. Avoidant silence when falling in love is different. It's sudden, unexplained, without timeline. The avoidant doesn't communicate their need for space because they often don't consciously recognize it's fear-driven. They just withdraw and hope you'll either wait or go away, both of which allow them to avoid confronting their feelings directly. Healthy space also doesn't involve complete disconnection. The secure person might need distance to think, but they maintain basic contact, reassure their partner, and work to return to connection. Avoidant silence tends toward total shutdown, where you're frozen out completely while they work through internal crisis you're not privy to. The healthy versus avoidant distinction also shows up in what happens after the space. Secure people use space to gain clarity and then come back to engage more deeply. Avoidants often use silence to try to kill feelings, and when they come back, it's usually not with more openness, but with the same defended patterns just slightly reset. Understanding this difference helps you recognize when you're dealing with healthy processing versus dysfunctional avoidance. How to know if you should wait through the silence. Deciding whether to wait through an avoidant's silence requires honest assessment. First, is there evidence they're actually falling in love versus just being generally avoidant? If this silence follows clear deepening of connection, waiting might make sense. Second, can you wait without sacrificing your well-being? If waiting means you're anxious, depressed, or putting your life on hold, don't wait. The cost is too high. Third, is there evidence they're doing work to change? Without evidence of therapy or work on their patterns, waiting just enables their dysfunction. The answer is usually no, or not indefinitely. You can hold space while also moving forward with your life. You don't have to wait around being hurt by their silence. What changes if the avoidant does the work? If the avoidant actually does therapeutic work to address their patterns, their response to falling in love can change dramatically. They can learn that vulnerability doesn't equal annihilation. They can develop tools to be with intense feelings without running. They can build capacity to communicate needs and fears rather than just withdrawing. When this work happens, future instances of falling in love don't trigger the same crisis and silence. The changed avoidant still might need to process intense feelings sometimes, but they do it differently. They communicate their need for space. They maintain connection while processing. They come back and engage rather than staying silent. The fear of love doesn't disappear completely, but it becomes manageable rather than consuming. However, this level of change requires serious, sustained therapeutic work, often over years. It's not something that happens quickly or easily. The avoidant has to want to change more than they want to stay comfortable. They have to be willing to face the childhood wounds that created these patterns. They have to practice new behaviors until they become natural. This is substantial work that many avoidants never do. If you're waiting for an avoidant who's in therapy and actively changing, that's very different from waiting for someone who's silent and not doing any work. One has potential for different outcomes, The other is just repeating the same pattern, expecting different results. Your waiting should be contingent on evidence of their work and change, not on hope that they'll spontaneously develop capacity they've never had. Why their silence is ultimately about them, not you. The most important thing to understand about an avoidant silence when falling in love is that it's entirely about their internal state and has nothing to do with your worth or lovability. You could be absolutely perfect and they'd still withdraw when feelings deepened because the withdrawal is about their capacity, not your value. This understanding should free you from trying to be different to prevent their silence. You can't be less threatening, less needy, less triggering, because the trigger is their own feelings, not your behavior. The silence will happen when they're falling in love, regardless of how well you manage your own needs and presentation. The silence being about them also means you can't fix it. You can't love them enough, be patient enough, or understand them enough to make them able to handle their feelings differently. Only they can do that work. Your understanding and patience might create space for that work to happen, but they don't substitute for the work itself. Understanding their silence is about them should also empower you to make choices based on your needs rather than their capacity. You're not required to wait through silence that hurts you just because you understand its source. You're allowed to need more than what someone falling in love but unable to be present can give you. Their limitation doesn't obligate your accommodation, and recognizing that is crucial for protecting yourself while they work out their relationship with vulnerability and love. The paradox of silence as love language for avoidance. For avoidance, silence becomes a twisted form of love language. Where secure people express love through words and presence, avoidants express the intensity of their feelings through absence. This isn't because they're cruel. It's because their nervous system has learned that love equals danger, and the only way to survive the danger is to create distance. This paradoxical love language creates profound confusion. You're wired to interpret silence as rejection, but for the avoidant who's falling in love, the silence is evidence of how deeply they care. They wouldn't need this much distance if you didn't matter this much. The paradox also explains why avoidance can seem most loving when feelings are casual and most distant when feelings are real. Casual affection doesn't threaten them, but real love triggers every defense they have. How childhood wounds create silence as response to love. The avoidant silence when falling in love isn't a conscious choice. It's a deeply ingrained response programmed by childhood experiences where expressing needs or showing feelings resulted in rejection or abandonment. Their nervous system learned that love is dangerous and silence is safety. The childhood programming also taught them that their feelings were too much, that needing people was weak. So when they fall in love as adults and those needs arise, they experience shame that drives them into silence. The wounds also created belief systems about love that make silence seem necessary. They believe that if you really knew how much they need you, you'd be disgusted. They believe that showing feelings gives you power to destroy them. The biological and nervous system aspects of avoidant silence. The avoidant silence when falling in love has biological components. When they experience vulnerability that comes with deep feelings, their nervous system goes into threat response. Their body is literally experiencing the physiological state of being under threat, and silence is their attempt to return to regulation. The biological response also includes their nervous system being unable to distinguish between perceived emotional threat and actual physical danger. When they feel vulnerable to you because they love you, their body responds as if they're in actual danger. The physiology also explains why avoidants often can't articulate why they need silence. When their nervous system is activated, their prefrontal cortex goes offline. They can't access rational thought or process emotions effectively. The difference between avoidant silence and stonewalling. It's crucial to distinguish between avoidant silence when falling in love and stonewalling as emotional abuse. Stonewalling is deliberate punishment, a power play. Avoidant silence is a fear response, a nervous system shutdown. Both create similar pain, but the intention and psychology are different. Avoidant silence typically happens in response to increasing intimacy or deepening feelings. The avoidant doesn't go silent to punish you. They go silent because their feelings are overwhelming them. Stonewalling usually happens in response to conflict. The other key difference is that avoidants in silence are genuinely suffering too. They're not enjoying the power of withholding. Stonewallers often seem comfortable with the silent treatment. When avoidant silence becomes a relationship pattern, when an avoidant silence in response to falling in love becomes repeated, it creates a toxic cycle. The pattern: connection deepens, avoidant feels overwhelmed, avoidant goes silent, you pursue or pull back, avoidant eventually returns, connection rebuilds, repeat. The pattern also tends to intensify over time. The first silence might last days. The next lasts weeks. Each cycle hurts more because you've been through it before. The pattern trains both partners in unhealthy dynamics. You learn to minimize needs to avoid triggering silence. They learn that silence works to manage overwhelm without developing better coping skills. The role of anxious attachment in responding to avoidant silence. If you have anxious attachment, the avoidant silence when falling in love will trigger your deepest wounds in ways that make the dynamic even more painful. Your anxious system interprets their silence as abandonment, which activates your protest behaviors: calling, texting, demanding explanations, trying to force connection. These protest behaviors confirm the avoidant's fear that you're too needy, which drives them deeper into silence, which triggers more of your protest, creating a destructive cycle. The anxious-avoidant dynamic in the context of silence also creates a trap where both partners are activating each other's worst patterns. Your anxiety makes their avoidance worse. Their avoidance makes your anxiety worse. Neither of you can regulate because you're both stuck in trauma responses, feeding off each other's dysregulation. Understanding your own anxious patterns is crucial for responding effectively to avoidant silence. When you can recognize that your urge to pursue comes from your own wound rather than from what the situation actually requires, you can make different choices. You can choose to self-soothe instead of pursuing. You can choose to maintain your own stability instead of trying to force them to provide it. This doesn't fix their avoidance, but it stops you from making it worse with your anxiety. The anxious-avoidant dynamic also reveals why relationships between these two attachment styles are particularly challenging. Both partners are looking to the other to regulate them, to prove they're lovable, to meet needs that are fundamentally their own responsibility. The avoidance silence can actually be an opportunity for the anxiously attached person to work on their own patterns, to practice self-soothing, to develop the security that makes them less vulnerable to others' inability to show up consistently. Working on your own attachment patterns doesn't mean accepting poor treatment from avoidance. It means developing enough security that you can recognize when someone's patterns are too dysfunctional to accommodate, and walking away becomes easier. Secure people don't stay with avoidants who go silent when falling in love because they know they deserve consistent presence. Anxious people stay hoping that if they just manage their anxiety well enough, the avoidant will stop being avoidant. Understanding this difference can motivate you to work on becoming more secure, which will naturally lead to choosing better partners. What happens if avoidant silence is never addressed? If the avoidance pattern of silence in response to falling in love is never addressed through therapeutic work, several outcomes are likely. First, the relationship will probably end when you finally get tired of the cycle and leave. Most people can only tolerate being withdrawn from so many times before they give up, and the avoidance refusal to address their patterns through therapy guarantees eventual abandonment. Second, if the relationship somehow continues despite unaddressed silence patterns, it will likely be characterized by low intimacy and high anxiety. You'll learn to keep things surface level to avoid triggering their withdrawal. You'll constantly manage your own needs and feelings. You'll live in chronic uncertainty about their feelings and commitment. This kind of relationship might be stable, but it won't be fulfilling. Third, the avoidant will likely continue the pattern in subsequent relationships. Each new partner will experience the same cycle of connection, followed by silence when feelings deepen. The avoidant will keep losing people they care about because they can't tolerate the vulnerability of loving them. The pattern will repeat until either they hit rock bottom hard enough to seek help or they resign themselves to shallow connections. Fourth, both partners miss the opportunity for real intimacy and growth. The avoidant stays trapped in defensive patterns that keep them safe but alone. You stay trapped in a dynamic that teaches you to minimize yourself and accept less than you deserve. Both of you lose the possibility of transformation that facing the silence pattern directly could create. The unaddressed silence also tends to create increasing resentment over time. You resent being withdrawn from every time feelings deepen. They resent feeling pressured by your needs for consistency. This mutual resentment poisons whatever connection exists and makes reconciliation increasingly unlikely, even if they eventually do therapeutic work. Signs the avoidant is ready to address their silence pattern. If you're deciding whether to give an avoidant who goes silent when falling in love another chance, you need to see specific signs they're ready to address the pattern. First, they need to be in therapy specifically working on attachment issues. Not just seeing a therapist to talk about stress, but actively doing attachment-focused work with someone qualified to address these deep patterns. Second, they need to be able to articulate their pattern clearly. They should be able to say something like, "When I start having deep feelings, I panic and withdraw because vulnerability feels dangerous. I recognize this is my wound and my responsibility to heal." This level of self-awareness indicates they've done some work already and understand what needs to change. Third, they should have concrete plans for managing triggers differently going forward, not vague promises to try harder or be better, but specific strategies like, "When I feel overwhelmed, I'll tell you I need an hour alone to regulate, and then I'll come back and talk about what I'm feeling." This specificity shows they've actually developed tools rather than just recognizing the problem. Fourth, they should be willing to go extremely slow in rebuilding and accept accountability measures. They should understand that trust needs to be rebuilt through consistency over time. They should be open to couples therapy, to regular check-ins about patterns, to you having boundaries about what you'll tolerate if old patterns emerge. Fifth, they should acknowledge the pain their silence has caused you without defensiveness. Not minimizing, not explaining it away, not making you feel like you're being too sensitive. Just genuine acknowledgement of harm done and remorse for having caused it. This emotional accountability is crucial for real change. Without these signs, any promises about being different are likely empty. The avoidant might genuinely want to change, but wanting and being ready are different things. Without evidence of readiness, giving them another chance just sets you up for the same cycle of silence when feelings deepen again.